Welcome to NeuroNoodles, Neurofeedback, and Neuropsychology podcast featuring our neuropsychologist Dr. Laura Jansons, Dr. Skip Rinn, Tech Whiz Santiago Brand, and Neurofeedback legend Jay Gunkelman. Our goal is to provide information and promote options for better mental health. This is an all-star cast. They're more than happy to share their knowledge with you. My name is Pete, and today we're going to go over some questions that have been emailed to us, questions that popped up on YouTube. We're doing our best to catch up, so hopefully we can help out our loyal listeners and viewers out there. But before we start, we'd like to thank our Patreon business supporters and especially our show sponsor. It's the 6th annual Superbrainsummit, April 8th at Bradley University, featuring Dr. Bruce Wexler. He's a psychiatrist at Yale Medical School. He'll discuss neurotherapeutics. How can we regulate the brain with computers? Register at bradley.edu/superbrainsummit. We're going to have Dr. Wexler on the show and in one of the next couple shows, guys, so stay tuned.
Excellent.
Please give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts. It really helps get the word out. If they can't hear us, we can't help them. A couple questions, guys. I'm just going to read them off. If we can address it, we address it. If we can't, we can't. Obviously, the Ukraine, the war, PTSD questions. We have some people we know in Russia that have probably gotten shut down. We may want to, talk about that a little bit. And then we had a question about leaky gut. I know we're not, Skip's not here. He's the leaky gut guy, but I'll just read the question and then we can address whatever we can address. Can you do a video on leaky gut and leaky blood-brain barrier? Do you think these things would show up on an EEG? I've also heard if you take GABA as a supplement, it will only have effect if you have a leaky blood-brain barrier. Say that 3 times fast. I'm interested to hear what you have to say about that. Is that anything we want to touch, or we want to hit that when Skip comes back?
If you eat GABA, you basically digest it. You'll break it down into its component parts, which may be useful for you to produce GABA later, but you don't end up with GABA because you eat GABA. You digest it. And as to leaky gut, I'm not an expert on gut. I'm an expert on brain, and blood-brain barrier is the brain's electrical patterns. I know that brain trauma and also toxicity can end up with a leaky blood-brain barrier. There's lots of ways to end up with that kind of a problem. But again, I think if we get somebody on the show that's more of a specialist in blood-brain barrier and gut health, that'd be the time to get a more complete answer on this. Ask me the EEG question, and I'll be happy to answer it. But I'm out of my league when I'm trying to talk about blood-brain barrier and GI.
Well, Jay, if we're going to talk about EEGs, isn't there a doctor we know over in Russia that is shut down now? Well, what's going on over there?
We actually had Yuri Kropotov on briefly with the Australian group. And Yuri, although he's a multiple professor, he's a professor in Trondheim, Norway, as well as his professorship in St. Petersburg, Russia. But his lab is the Institute for the Human Brain, which is about maybe 200 yards from the Pavlov Shrine. And in neuroscience in Russia, how you have to indicate how you're related to Pavlov somehow before you actually write anything else in your paper. So, and Yuri's lab is a premier lab. Moscow has got its own neuroscience center, and St. Petersburg is as well. When it was the Soviet Union as an intact union, Yuri and his lab were the head of neuroscience for the Soviet Union. So it's a major laboratory. Vera Grenyunchenko is an MD, PhD, epileptologist, child neurologist, and she's been doing the EEG interpretations for us after I retired. We looked around for somebody that could do competent work, and we're kind of underwhelmed by a lot of the people that we interviewed by having them write reports, and her reports look like I wrote them. I mean, we're very, very pleased with her work. The difficulty is, right now, the banking system in Russia, good luck with that. Try to pay somebody in Russia. So the physician that's working for us writing reports at Brain Science International ends up being kind of stuck behind the Russian system being shut down right now. About a week before the shutdown happened, when it came around to paying her for that month, we sent 3 months worth of pay, not the 1 month that we owed at the moment. And so we paid her in U.S. dollars, and she got it before the shutdown. So it shouldn't interrupt our service, but pretty much anything in Russia right now is difficult. Their train system is shut down. If you get on a train, it's because you have a handwritten ticket, and you can't handwrite tickets at the rate that Apple Pay and all of those things were doing it. So their systems over there are in big trouble.
Now, can you communicate with email to them, or we don't know yet?
Yeah. Email's not a difficulty. If you change the language that you're in from Russian to English, services are a lot more open on the internet from Russia. But if you're communicating in Russian, a lot of the services that you could access online are disallowed at the moment. And
are you going to have to get good with Bitcoin?
I hope not. Luckily, it seems to be working out for now for us. Now, I have to say, being able to get around something that's happening in the middle of a war about paying somebody is the least of the problems that are happening in a war. It's an ugly circumstance. Look at all the families that are disturbed and being destroyed, the kids that have been killed. It's just a gigantic tragedy.
Well, Jay, a couple emails came in on PTSD. What do we want to address that? Like, what is PTSD? What is going on? What can we anticipate over there? You have Ukraine, and then you have the Russian soldiers going in who may or may not want to be there. You have all these conflicts going on. What's going on in the EEG, Jay, and then Dr. Laura, what's going on from a psychological standpoint?
Not everybody that is exposed to trauma ends up with PTSD. If you have an increased arousal level, you're more likely to end up with a PTSD than if you have a low arousal level. Unfortunately, people that are sharp and bright have a propensity towards having experiences that end up with a post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, the military prefers calling it post-traumatic stress and dropping the D, because if you call it a disorder, soldiers are not really willing to stand in line saying, I have a disorder. They want to say, I am all I can be, so I don't have anything wrong with me. Mm-hmm. And that's a problem. You need to be able to reach out for help in order to get help. And step one is allowing them to reach out. So let's drop the D if we can, if we're talking to military people. You have to be exposed to trauma and still feel traumatized for 6 months before it's a formal diagnosis. It doesn't mean you haven't had PTSD before the formal diagnosis. It just means that they couldn't diagnose it. The first 3 months were still post-traumatic stress. It's just not a formal diagnosis until you've held it for a long period of time. In Israel, they studied a little kibbutz that had a terrorist event, and everybody was traumatized. Well, they studied them carefully. At the end of 1 year, 60% of the people in the little kibbutz were over it. They were getting on with their life. They didn't feel post-traumatic stress disorder at the end of 1 year. Now, the researchers thought, well, it's an incline. It's just on its way down. If we wait another 6 months or a year, the percentage will continue to drop. Didn't happen. The 40% who had PTSD long-term at 1 year didn't really get over it with more time. But if you think about it, if you have a phobia about spiders, waiting a year, you don't have less of a phobia about spiders. Once you've got it locked in, it's there. You've been traumatized. Now, phobias aren't the same as PTSD, but a very simple model that's got some analogies to learn from. PTSD happens when you have a high arousal level and then you're exposed to something that gives you a higher arousal level in a panicky overarousal. And you classically condition what it is that triggered you. So altitude, spiders, whatever. You could be afraid of almost anything with a phobia. But in order to get rid of a phobia, you have to drop the arousal level as step one. You can't expose them to a hierarchy of things that are more like spiders a little at a time, fuzzy dice, and you can't expose them to anything until you've dropped the arousal level, or you simply re-traumatize. So in PTSD, there's a lot of exposure therapy that happens before you've actually effectively dropped the person's arousal level to the point where they can experience something without being re-traumatized by it. So in PTSD, the re-exposure approach is ill-advised until later in therapy. You can't do it initially because it's a mistake until you drop the arousal level. In EEG, PTSD has some very common findings. And depending upon the age at which you are traumatized, it encodes at the frequencies that are available at the age. So if you're traumatized as a very young kid, the lower frequencies that are available to you at that age, age 2, 3 years old, you've got delta and theta content. You don't really have alpha in the alpha band yet, so you don't expect to see their trauma in the alpha band. You see a slower focus. And the location is the right temporoparietal junction, where you perceive faces and body language and the emotional content of speech, all the social milieu that you're in. And if you can't, and if it's got a slow focus or an alpha excess in that area, you don't perceive affect properly. And if people have had PTSD, they have difficulties with an accurate perception. They'll misperceive and be triggered very easily, but proper perception of emotion requires that area to be functional, and it requires an intervention. Neurofeedback can suppress the slow content or alpha content in the right temporoparietal junction, the T6 or P8 electrode, and that location can end up coming back online. And we've seen this repeatedly. EEG neurofeedback combined with trauma therapy ends up opening up the therapy. If you're all the therapy you want to do until you actually get the right temporoparietal junction starting to work is going to be obstructed by the person's inability to perceive affect properly. And once you get that perception cleared, then the therapy moves forward much more readily. Bessel van der Kolk has popularized neurofeedback for trauma. He's a big name in the trauma circles for a reason. I mean, he's Trauma Research Foundation is his foundation. And he's extremely favorable towards biomedical interventions because he's a psychiatrist, MD, not just talk therapy. He actually sees the biomedical underpinnings and has popularized the use of clonidine to deal with beta excesses, which are overarousal biomarkers. And again, you have to drop arousal before you do exposure. So his biomedical approach ends up being very, very positive. We had Seaburn Fisher on. She's worked along with the Trauma Research Foundation and that area specifically, and has been the proponent of the early proponent of trauma interventions with neurofeedback, FPO2, right temporal work. Those things emerged from her work, not from some big research lab somewhere, but from an individual clinician working with trauma survivors. So I would suggest the PTSD that's likely happening in Ukraine is going to end up being families with kids that have trauma. Obviously, parents people don't have as much concern for parents as kids, but parents get traumatized as well and need to have the same kind of intervention. If you're traumatized, you're not going to be a great therapist for your kid. So, and soldiers as well. It's an unfortunate circumstance that people are exposed to traumatic circumstances like war, but apparently a lot of unwitting Russian soldiers were rounded up and sent to Ukraine. They apparently have a 40-mile-long convoy that they can't keep moving. The engines keep not working in the trucks. You know, one packet of sugar into a gas tank ruins the engine really well. You know, and if you slice a hose, it doesn't work very well. So there's a lot of soldiers doing sabotage on vehicles,
right.
And but then they're not feeding them either. So war is hell, whether you're on one side or the other. The people trying to inflict the circumstance are being traumatized as well.
Well, over a third of our listeners are international. Any advice we can give or any thoughts, Dr. Laura, on PTSD? Number one, stay alive.
I can please stay alive. I'll dovetail into what Jay was saying. A couple things. One, if you go to DSM, we can define PTSD in a behavioral system. It's my opinion, I think all of our opinions, DSM is pretty limited. The PTSD diagnosis was designed to deal with military vets. And, certainly we have other people, and we're going through a war now, so we're talking about military vets, but we're also talking about families and children, as Jay mentioned. So I think the point is that if you're exposed to a threat, and I think the point that can be made, you're exposed to a threat, you see a bomb go off in front of you, you see your bunkmate get blown to smithereens. I mean, that is definitely something very frightful. I've worked with some vets in the past, and what I learned from the experience of working with these folks is that it's not just that they're exposed to a threat, but they either perceive a threat is coming, or it could be a fictive threat. It could be something that they are worried is going to happen. I had one gentleman years ago who, he was sitting in his bunk and he never saw anything traumatic, but he heard the whistle of these shells going over his building, and just the sound, like, these bombs could hit me, they could hit my neighbor, they could hit, the kids in the town next door. Just the expectation that you can get hit is enough to cause a trauma. So you're exposed to a threat, a possible threat, it could happen, and then you have a physical reaction, like your body kind of separates, your mind kind of separates from the reality, and your biology or physiology kind of takes over the fight or flight system, and that is, certainly right hemisphere stuff, trying to protect yourself from the environment. The other thing that Bessel van der Kolk brought up was that he kind of talked about the signature of certainly the right hemisphere over the temporal parietal junction, over the right fight or flight, the amygdala regions. But he also brought up this point that you can have a disruption in the front left, in the F3 regions. He brings up the point of fight, flight, and freeze. And so when you're frozen, you get spooked, and I'm being minimizing a little bit, but you get the crap scared out of you. You can't speak, and so your front left area, your Broca type area, retrieval and expression, those areas kind of shut off, and you can see that in a signature of a EEG pattern, and that's definitely something Bessel brought up. And Seaburn Fisher also, talked about developmental traumas in terms of your more posterior brain regions. She talked about the brain development from the bottom up, and so we're talking about brainstem regions. We're talking about cerebellar regions. But she brought up great points about the vestibular system, the vestibular cochlear system, your balance, your GPS, and being able to have a soothing mechanism. So Jay was making the point that, if you're already over aroused or you're already easily triggered, so to speak, and then you get put into a situation, you're fragile already, and then you get the crap scared out of you, and now you're, extra on guard for sure. But Seaburn Fisher brought up the point that, as you're a developing child, you need to have your vestibular system integrated, so that, the mother's rocking, just being very basic and developmental, mother's rocking of a child can develop this soothing pattern, that you're calm and you believe you're safe. Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You need this kind of base of safety before you can go on and, experience, sketchy things in life, so to speak. And so, that's a real problem. So if you have people who have developmental issues, not good family systems, et cetera, other traumas, other threats, substance abuse, et cetera, autocratic leaders, I don't know if you want to get into that, but the point is, then you put someone into a war situation or another threatening situation. Car accidents can produce a acute trauma response. It may not develop into PTSD. You need 6 months of symptoms to kind of qualify for the diagnosis. So,
let's take a break in the action to tell you about the Super Brain Summit at Bradley University. You can check it out online at bradley.edu/superbrainsummit. It's happening this April 8th. Featured speaker will be Dr. Bruce Wexler, an international expert on digital neurotherapeutics, and he's a psychiatrist at Yale School of Medicine. Hey, visit the Brain Cave, walk through the brain using Oculus Quest. How cool. Check it out April 8th, bradley.edu/superbrainsummit.
So again, to the DSM for PTSD or PT, post-traumatic stress, I like that we want to drop the disorder because it's a normal reaction. It's a normal reaction to being threatened. And so, if your body is going to run because there's a bear chasing you, that's normal. If your body is going to be on high alert because there's someone, on the corner with a gun, well, good. Yeah, you should be on high alert. So it's a normal response to a threatening situation. And so, you're going to have a heightened startle response. You're going to have flashbacks where you experience or relive the trauma. And, the basic point in terms of evolution and defense is if you're, running away from a dangerous thing, that's a normal thing, but you're also going to be overly protective. And, to a degree, that's good. You're not going to be jumping out of airplanes and running in the street and running toward a threat, so to speak, if you have a heightened startle response. So it's that, the flashbacks, you can have nightmares, you avoid things related to the trauma. So there's this kind of list of symptoms. And, things are kind of dysregulated on the emotional front in terms of the limbic system. Your memories are attached to your emotions, and being able to identify threats, as Jay was saying, with the right hemisphere temporal parietal junctions. Who's friend, who's foe, all of those kind of things. You're talking about verbal expression, et cetera. And so, the point, what do you do about it? So if the dysregulation is right hemisphere, certainly want to work there, but there can be a disruption in the default mode network where you're kind of flooded with negative imagery and, my understanding of, you can do stuff like alpha theta training, which kind of disconnects the emotional experience from the movie. Like you can watch, so to speak, the movie or relive the event, but kind of being detached from the emotional experience. And that's what a lot of the trainings, the goals is to allow someone to process, so to speak, or have the visual experience or the memory experience, but not have the extreme, air quotes, overreaction when someone is in a safe environment. So, from neurofeedback standpoint, there's certainly lots of trainings. And then, the point is to learn to get grounded. So there's some psychological interventions in terms of, mindfulness training, helping people get grounded. But I think everybody these days, Bessel van der Kolk would say that, psychotherapy can help only to a degree. The rest of the work needs to be physiological. This is a physiological condition, and you have to get after it with a physiological technique, such as neurofeedback. He brings up yoga as an intervention. EMDR are things that can be effective working with post-traumatic stress. So, some of this stuff you can talk all day long, so to speak, in psychotherapy, but that doesn't necessarily get after the physiological overstimulated brains that people experience with post-traumatic stress.
The left frontal location at F3 that they've identified is the same spot that taps into the vagal nerve, which is obviously the fight, flight, freeze aspect of it. The vagal nerve activates parasympathetic activity. The F3 location is where the TMS people point the magnet. And if it's actually the correct location, when they pulse the magnet, it slows the heart. The normal biobehavioral marker for TMS is the spot that makes your fingers wiggle. But Martijn Arns in the Netherlands found the spot also makes the heart slow. So the second measurement of whether you got the spot correct or not is, measure forward from the spot that makes the fingers wiggle. But if you got the right spot, it'll make the heart decelerate. So there's a biological basis to tie the F3 location into the fight, flight, freeze response. Now, one part about PTS that people don't quite commonly talk about is the moral injury. I had a client who was a tank driver and a medic, and he expected when he went over there to see blood and gore. That didn't bother him one bit, not one iota. But as a tank driver at night, they're flying down the road as fast as they can. They don't want to be shot at from the sides. They're just trying to get there. Kids will run out onto the road looking to get candy, and he ran over some kids, and he could not get over that. He would wake up in the middle of the night seeing his own kids in front of his tank that he was running over. And the moral injury of him having killed a child was what bothered him. None of the missing legs, missing arms, bloody stumps, intestines hanging out, none of that bothered him one little bit. There was no trauma from that experience. But the car accident of driving a tank over a bunch of kids was enough to absolutely ruin his sleep. He hadn't slept well in years. So I would suggest that the moral violation, if you do something that violates your morals, or if you see things that violate your morals, those are things that injure you in a way that simply the sight of something doesn't do it. Now, there are plenty of people that blood and guts is enough. It violates their sense of right and wrong to see something that's inside be outside, and that upsets them rather badly. That's enough. You don't necessarily have to have some biblical, code that you violated directly. The regular trauma is sufficient for most people. But the thing that's not talked about quite often is the moral injury aspect of PTS. And for soldiers, sometimes you have to do things in war that hopefully you wouldn't consider doing elsewhere. So there's kind of a built-in violation.
Well, you said drop the D. What about dropping the P post? I mean, they have stress right now, and people in Eastern Europe that are listening to us, right now, is there any advice we can offer them what to do to get through this?
To be all you can be as a soldier or a citizen, you need to learn how to wind it down. In the midst of chaos, you have to be able to find your center. And one of the techniques that's very useful is the heart rate variability pattern breathing. You can actually turn yourself from sympathetically over-dominant to being more balanced with HRV training. So slow, deep breathing, 4 seconds in, 6 seconds out, 5 and 5. I mean, different people have different ratios of how much inhale and exhale to use. But if you don't have a therapist directly working with you, just go for deep, slow breathing, about 5 seconds in, 5 seconds out, 6 breaths in a minute for anybody that's past puberty is a reasonable rate. If you're old and you have cardiac problems, you may have to be a little bit faster than that, but slow it down and make the breathing deep belly breathing, not fast, shallow breathing. That actually grabs your physiology and changes your balance of sympathetic parasympathetic balance towards a balance with some parasympathetic and sympathetic content, so you're not just overly jacked up. Being jacked up excessively is one of the things that can lead you to experiencing something as trauma. So getting past it ends up being very useful.
Say they're listening to us right now. What are the exercises we can have them do, Jay?
Heart rate variability training ends up being very useful for balancing the sympathetic over-arousal with some parasympathetic balance. And deep, slow belly breathing is what you're looking for. Ideally, a therapist will hook you up to a device and they'll come up with a personalized frequency for exact breathing. But as a general rule, it's about 6 breaths in a minute, which is 1 breath every 10 seconds. 5 seconds in, 5 seconds out will do it. Doing 4 in and 6 out will be a little bit more parasympathetic tending, but slow, deep breathing is the simple fix. I actually had a friend who was going to go over to work with Syrian refugees in France, and she asked me, what EEG device should I bring with me? And I said, well, quite honestly, I think you should focus on HRV, because you could fix one person with neurofeedback in maybe 6 weeks, 2 months, and that's one person. You might get 5 or 6, or maybe if you're really busy, 10 in a day on a device. But if you do HRV and you train somebody on pattern breathing, they can teach somebody else on pattern breathing, and you have influences on thousands of people in the same period of time that you would have influenced a few dozen. So, and she took the advice. Now, the Syrian refugees didn't really do any work with her immediately because they didn't trust anybody immediately. And eventually, one of the elders kind of decided he would do some work with her. He found relief, advised others to go, and pretty soon she was swamped with people. I mean, as soon as she was accepted as somebody who was, really trying to help them as opposed to trying to, do something to them that they didn't want to have done, her work was accepted, and she helped a lot of people with the HRV approach. And again, it would have been very limited if she would have been doing neurofeedback. So we're dealing with a giant war zone. There's not enough therapists to parachute in and help with everybody. So something that can help en masse, that may not be the perfect fix, but it's a piece of the fix. And slow pattern, deep belly breathing is a piece of the fix. It will help you wind down your over-arousal, keep you from having panic attacks, ramp up from being over-aroused. So what can they do? Well, obviously, deeper relaxation with muscle, EEG training, and all of that is fine and dandy, but the number of people that would be able to have access to that is pretty limited. So deep, slow belly breathing is, I think, the thing that we can hand off without technology having to be associated with it.
Easy for us to say, right?
Yeah. I've seen, voluntary slow breathing help people that tend towards panic avoid common panic attacks that they were having. It seems to be very useful, and I think that's the one thing we can suggest that doesn't end up requiring us to parachute in with hardware. And just the idea of breathing slower, deeper, abdominal, not thoracic, you end up having positive impact. Tapping into a therapist is important. The Israeli kibbutz that 60% of the people got over it in a year is going to happen. Some of the people in the war zone will end up not really having the same problem a year from now with it. They'll kind of get back to their life if it were to suddenly stop. But there are a lot of people that have had their normal expectation of their life shattered. Their expectation of the future shattered. You have to start questioning, why am I here? What am I really doing? I mean, there's going to be a lot of existential crisis that's triggered by all of this in a way that's difficult to recover from. It's important for people to reach out to therapy people to end up having help. This is not something you tackle alone. Get rid of the whole D at the end. You've had trauma, and it's a normal thing to have stress after trauma. You suffer strain from the stress. It's normal to have some problems from that, sleep difficulties, all sorts of neurocognitive changes. Please reach out for some help. There are a lot of therapists that specialize in this area, but even a therapist that's not a specialist in the area will be able to do some assistance and potentially hook you up with people that are more specialized. So I think the important thing is for people to feel free to reach out without the stigma of something being wrong. This is a normal response to these stressors.
The other piece is, when we're talking about post-traumatic stress versus an acute stress syndrome, or when you diagnose an acute stress syndrome, means you've exposed to a threat, but your symptoms don't persist. They kind of wind down after a month or so. Whereas with post-traumatic stress, the criteria is, these symptoms last for 6 months and longer. The thing that could prevent an acute stress syndrome from turning into post-traumatic stress is the piece that Jay is talking about, that if you can talk about what's going on, you have a great chance of the acute stress not converting into post-traumatic stress. So even, kind of finding a therapist, talking it out. I'm thinking, I was in a car accident, and that's minimal, a small car accident, by the way, but a small car accident, minimal compared to what people are suffering in Ukraine. And by talking about it, I was spooked. I was afraid to get back into a car, and the symptoms lasted a couple weeks, but I absolutely talked about it, actually, went through everything. And that was useful for me personally, but that is a good point, that you don't. It's not a foregone conclusion that you get traumatized and that has to last 6 months and longer. You can actually intervene early and prevent some worse things from happening.
The arousal level ends up being a major influence on how easily you recover. Remember the phobia model. Drop your arousal level is step one. Let's say you had trauma and you've learned how to drop your arousal level. You may not have a therapist set up a hierarchy of things that slowly decouple you from your trauma, but life experienced with a lower arousal level will slowly decouple you from your trauma. You need to drop your arousal level first. And it's important for you to work with somebody who has body-oriented therapy that can actually look at your depth of relaxation, because all of the thinking doesn't really equate to having your body deeply relaxed. And until you actually work on the body itself, the body, as Bessel's book says, the body keeps a score.
The other piece of it, I'm thinking that there's a little paperback textbook, The Relaxation Response. I think it was written in the 70s, but they talk about the 3 R's of relaxation. One of them has to do with making sure you shut the adrenaline down. So adrenaline starts the fight or flight system, and it's a chemical response that can last, or typically lasts 4 minutes. Anything that lasts beyond 4 minutes, once you've achieved safety, can be you talking yourself into, more anxiety. So there's a part of this where you do want to do some self-talk restructuring to help yourself get reminded that, you look around where you are, you're physically safe, you're grounded, you can feel the table and the chair, and doing those kind of exercises, because your adrenaline can keep pumping, could be, days on end almost, because you're re-traumatizing yourself, so to speak, by reliving and by, catastrophizing and all those things we talk about in cognitive behavioral therapy. So that's the other piece of it. You got to get to a place where you can get a hold of your thinking and prevent the adrenaline from still kicking around.
The image of the trauma, to inflict the trauma back on you, and realizing that you're in a safe place, getting the image of yourself in a safe place as opposed to seeing yourself in the traumatic experience again, helps you get past it.
Well, Yuri, hang in there.
I don't even know if Yuri's in Russia right now. He could be in Trondheim, Norway, at the Technical University, where he's a professor as well. I don't know where he's located specifically at the moment. I do hope he's doing well. If you're the head of a major institution in Russia and you speak out, the entire institution may be penalized. I don't expect to hear Yuri saying one thing or the other, because he's got an entire staff dependent on him not messing up their circumstance as well. There are a lot of people protesting. I hope they have an effective intervention on their government, but I don't expect to hear anything loud from a specific mouth from the head of an agency, because again, that would have negative influence on all the people downslope from him.
Well, we just hope that the people are trying to do good out there over there, that can stay connected and help people. We thank you all for listening to NeuroNoodle's Neurofeedback and Neuropsychology podcast. We'd like to thank our Patreon business supporters. We'd also like to thank our show sponsor, the 6th Annual Superbrain Summit, this April 8th at Bradley University, featuring Dr. Bruce Wexler. He's a psychiatrist at Yale Medical School. He'll discuss neurotherapeutics and how we can regulate the brain with computers. Register now at bradley.edu/superbrainsummit. Hey, do you have an idea for a topic or guest? Please email me, Pete, at neuronoodle.com. Please give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And again, hey, if you really, really like us, you can buy us a coffee on Patreon/neuronoodle. We love our Patreon peeps, all of them, don't we, Jay?
Absolutely. Where else do they get this kind of coverage?
Well, we're trying to clean things up, trying to get different opportunities for our sponsors out there. All right, guys, stay safe. All of our Eastern European peeps, please stay alive. Do your breathing exercises, and then listen to us next week. Cue the music.